Welcome. My name is Gail McCormick. I'm a new member of the board of the Historical Society of Frankfurt. I'm a retired librarian and archivist. And today's talk and exhibit and book are sort of near the end of the road of a very, very long research project that was spurred by a family discovery. My grandparents were longtime residents of Frankfurt, and I discovered that my grandmother, and I didn't discover until she passed away, that she was a member of the Swedenborgian church, the New Jerusalem church in Frankfurt, which I knew nothing about. So I embarked on that journey literally at the age of 19. And so I was doing it for a while. I did have dark hair. So what I want to talk to you about today is the exhibit. Some of you have gotten a chance to look at it. Is kind of the Reader's Digest condensed version of my 2-volume history, which each volume covers about 100 years of history. It's about the church, but it's the view of Frankfurt, a history of Frankfurt from the viewpoint of the church, what they could see sort of in their periphery, how they were, their experiences in Frankfurt, but also in the city, and their influence here and within the city and in the country as well. The presentation is going to sort of have to be yet another abridgment of that, but I'm trying to give you a sense, maybe an overview, a little bit of a timeline, give you a sense of the congregation. Before I get started, though, I do want to introduce a few people that are here that have been supportive of my research over time. Certainly Susan Couvreur is probably in the back, and Richard, there she is, who's has helped me find things in this collection, not only to illustrate the book, but also for the exhibit. Fred Prescott, a third-generation member of the church, who provided me some insight on what it was like to grow up in the church in the 40s and 50s, and also contributed a few personal family items for the exhibit as well. Let's see who else I wanted to mention. Bill Patterson, who's the archivist of the Philadelphia Sketch Club, who helped me with some research related to some artists who were involved in the Frankfurt story, particularly architect William Gray, who created the church that still stands on Paul and Unity Street. And also I want to welcome Reverend Chris Barber and his wife, Annika. Chris is an ordained priest in the General Church in Bryn Athyn, and also a professor of religion at the Academy School. And I had the opportunity to meet Chris and an informal group of Swedenborgian historians at the denominational conference last summer. And it was so exciting to find people who were excited about the topic of Swedenborgians in Frankfurt as I was. Just to get you started a little bit, if you have any questions, if you get the book, or if you look at the exhibit, or if you want to come back and take more time with the exhibit, I've put my Historical Society email address there. Feel free. We are going to make reservations or for anyone who wants to come in, and just like we would for a research appointment, that sort of thing. So I'm going to move on here. The New Jerusalem Society of Frankfurt had a very interesting beginning as a free will Baptist church. And what I want to emphasize here is that the fluidity of religion in this early period of time, where people felt perfectly comfortable picking and choosing from various bits of religious thought and creating a belief system that was meaningful to them or meaningful to their community. The Free Will Baptists were actually originally Methodists who became enamored of baptism by immersion, and then began to read Swedenborg. And so their first discipline was sort of an amalgam of all those bits of faith. And I started, like many people who do research in Frankfurt, with Guernsey Hallowell's Brief History of Frankfurt, written in 1912, which is sort of an overview, a thematic overview, churches, schools, transportation, so forth, just like the papers read of the Historical Society, which cover different topics. The one thing, though, that I realized in starting to look at Frankfurt, that if you think about any recent scholarship that includes references to Frankfurt, of which there really isn't very much, that there's a very heavy burden put on Guernsey Hallowell and his colleagues who were writing papers for the Historical Society. Because oftentimes what they had to say about early Frankfurt was not only the first step, but was the last step. And I don't think any of them expected their research to be that any more than I expect my own. I think they hoped that people would take the research that they had done and jump off with it, to dig deeper into Frankfurt's history, and that hasn't always been the case. The one drawback of these early papers, early local history essays, we ran into that. I was director of the Historical Society of Washington Library for over a decade, and with a similar series of papers. And the drawback is that they're not well documented. That wasn't really common at that time. So one of the things I've tried to do, that I'm hoping that my research will be a jumping off point, is to try to be as scrupulous as possible in documenting the family information, the family assumptions I've made, other analyses that I've provided, and quotations that I've been as thorough as possible in providing that, so someone can jump off from my research as well. Guernsey Hallowell, T. Worcester Worrell, who wrote on Frankfurt in the 40s, David Simmons Rohr, who wrote his paper on Frankfurt in the 1830s. I'm very fortunate they were also members of the New Jerusalem Society. So I was able to get some perspective on the church from their writings, as well as perspective on Frankfurt. And one of the most significant documents, though, that Guernsey Hallowell provided for the history of the church in Frankfurt was his transcript of a book which is lost. Fred and I live in hope that someday we will find it in this building. But Thomas Boyle, who was the minister of the Free Will Baptist Church in 1820, published an account of establishing the Free Will Baptist Church in Frankfurt, who was involved, how the community reacted to the church, a very valuable document. But if it weren't for Guernsey Hallowell's 1930 transcript, we would know nothing about that. And I just saw Carol Odner walk in, and Carol Odner is the director of the Swedenborgiana and research at the Swedenborg Library in Granathen, and she manages the vault that this very important document sits in. And so I've been doing research in Carol's library for many, many years, and when I first looked at this, it was so fascinating because, as an historian, the document really had three layers. It had Thomas Boyle's original layer, Guernsey Hallowell's annotations, who kind of updating the reader about who these people were, where Thomas Boyle was talking about, if it wasn't a place that would have been recognizable in 1930. And one of the things that struck me was this small piece clipping, a newspaper clipping that's taped to the top of the transcript. And it really took me back when I first looked at it, which is probably 25 years ago now. It was the notice of the dissolution of the church in 1971. And it struck me because it would have been published in the paper about the time my grandmother passed away on May 4th, 1971. So as someone who tends to see symbolism in a lot of things, that particularly struck me. So I'm going to just set the stage about where the church established itself as a Free Will Baptist church. And also, this is such a glorious map. The color is pretty stunning. Let me put the pointer on here. Thomas Boyle mentions that the first meetings of the church were held in Ellen Simmons' home, the 6 Milestone. Samuel Swope was another early member, and he lived on Rocky Hill out in the same area. And eventually the church, though, would establish its meeting house just below the 5th Milestone. You can kind of see this little tributary here. And this is where Hedge Street would be. And the Worrell family, who's going to be very influential for generations in the society, Edna Worrell, here in the Historical Society, in her collection, there's an 1807 deed, and it's the purchase at a sheriff's sale of property on Hedge Street in 1807. It was purchased by a cousin of the Worrell family, John Worrell, who had also left the Quakers but had gone into the Frankford Presbyterian Church, and Henry Castor. They purchased land around Hedge Street in 1807. Part of that property would be purchased by the Free Will Baptists about 1818, and then it would build their meeting house there. But I think what's even more interesting about that particular deed is within 2 years of Worrell and Castor purchasing that property, in 1809 and 1812, free black laborer James Bowser of the Northern Liberties purchased property directly from Worrell and Castor, and his family gives the name to Bowser Street. You'll see the picture of the church, and it was situated on the corner of what was Bowser and Hedge Street. And James Bowser's family would be instrumental in establishing the AME church that you now know as Campbell AME. It was Second Bethel at that time. So the Free Will Baptists and the first African-American community here were neighbors. And I think that it's not so unusual not to say that probably economics may have had something to do with them purchasing the land there, but Thomas Boyle comments in his account about how people would walk by their church, see how they were worshiping and laugh and walk away. They apparently had a very energetic form of worship. They baptized at the waterside, and I think they may have found actually greater tolerance among the African American community than some of the other more traditional churches in the area. As I mentioned, the Worrell family, there's a lot about the Worrell family in the exhibit, so I won't go into too much now. But Reverend Isaac Worrell, again, going back to this fluidity of religion in the early part of this period, the family were originally Quakers when they came to this area and branched off into various religious groups. But his great-grandfather, John Worrell, was one of the Keithian Quakers who separated from the Society of Friends over theological issues and also over the issue of abolition. They were strongly abolitionists and broke away from the Society of Friends, and also were instrumental in founding Trinity Church, Oxford. They became Anglicans. Reverend Worrell's father, Demas Worrell, was the music choir master at Trinity Church, Oxford, and they would become important in the Frankfurt Church as well because of their music. The Jolly Post Hotel, most of you probably know of that, but may not realize that Reverend Worrell's great-grandfather John actually purchased that originally as a residence, and then his son later used it as an inn. But at the same time as the former Methodists, former Baptists, Swedenborgians are settling in Frankfurt, there's another group of Swedenborgians that are finding their way to Frankfurt from England. And it's a particularly unique group. The Manchester Swedenborgians were different had a different focus than Swedenborgians in London. Reverend John Cluse was an Anglican minister who openly preached the Swedenborg theology in the pulpit. He was well known, well loved, and so it was tolerated. And he also traveled around within about a 6-mile radius of Manchester, visiting all of these small communities. And one of the fallacies that I think I've seen in writings about Swedenborg and who were attracted to his writings, that working class men and women in England, particularly weavers, read a lot. They often propped books, the Bible, Milton, the mystic writers, William Law, Jacob Boehme, on their looms. They read voraciously, and they were interested in natural science and art. And so they had read many of the mystics, as had Reverend John Close. And one of his, I think his best quotes was that the mystics, though, never told him what to do with his hands and his feet. And he focused on the issue of charity, of love to one's neighbor, of assisting your communities. And Thomas Sidebotham, James Seddon, Samuel Pilling, all of whom would become very important here in Frankfurt, all were in these little communities where Reverend Close was meeting. In fact, James Seddon's father invited John Close to meet there in their home. But what was happening in the ravages of the Industrial Revolution in these little towns, the poverty and the effect on the land and the rivers, that although Methodism had an earlier meaning to the working class, people were moving away from the idea of personal salvation, and they thought what they really needed was a faith that would help them be active in their communities. So I think what's important to remember that these men brought with them their textile trades, and they helped build the Industrial Revolution here in Frankfurt. But they also came with the idea of building a different kind of community so that the same sorts of things didn't happen here as happened in their native country. And yet at the same time, yet another group of Swedenborgians is making their way across the Atlantic here to Philadelphia. The Bible Christians, William Cowherd was their leader. He was actually an assistant to Reverend Close, but he broke away, and they stressed non-sectarianism. They called themselves Bible Christians in the hopes that would focus on the two main interests of the sect, that they believed in the sacred word of the Bible and the divinity of Christ. But the unique aspect of their beliefs was abstinence from alcohol and vegetarianism. They established their first church right here in Kensington on North 3rd, and what was Franklin is now Girard. Here's where the church was, very near Globe Mills. They were all bleachers, dyers. Salford was the center of that industry. Jeremiah Horrocks is going to be a familiar name to those of you in Frankfurt who know the founding of industries here in Frankfurt. And I've put this very stark quote from Bible Christian James Wright, who, if any of you were in the exhibit, he's going to be, he was one of the founders of the Oxford Provident. But the vegetarianism, at least initially, was not a health issue. It was a reform issue. The Bible Christians and Quakers had a lot in common when they came to Philadelphia because they were both very interested in abolition reform, in other social reforms, and they felt that vegetarianism was a peaceful approach to life. Usefulness. One of the first examples of this idea of usefulness, charity to one's neighbors, is the Oxford Provident Building Association. The Bible Christians actually had set one of these up in their own church in Lancashire. They brought this idea with them. It's identified as the first building and loan association in America. A cooperative building association where people pool their resources, so at the end of a decade, everyone can build their own house. I have a whole exhibit case about the Oxford Provident in the other room. And I want you to take a close look because in 1931, when it had its centennial, The nostalgia about this group and the depth of the depression was palpable. Morton Bodfish actually came here when this building was brand new in 1930. He was the president of the Building and Loan League, went through all of the early minutes of the Oxford Provident and wrote an essay using the minutes and also talking to the descendants of people who were founders. But a real mythology grew up around these men. In fact, they became, rock stars nationally. I mean, I found California papers that were talking about Thomas Seibothem's tavern and the men that were gathered around red checkered tablecloths. It was a very nostalgic look at what was happening. And this carries all the way into 1981, the sesqui of the organization and the really demise of the Building and Loan. The Frankfurt Lyceum was also another cooperative venture grown out of the old mechanics institutes in Britain, where it was kind of a self-education, giving the working man a chance to learn about science and technology. This is just a little clipping. I hope if you haven't had a chance, you'll take a look. Susan recently found a very interesting document in the safe, rolled up about this big, and it's this gigantic proposal for what became the Frankfurt Lyceum in 1836, with nearly 60 names on it. And you see all the usual suspects. Thomas Seibothem's on there, James Seddon is on there, Jeremiah Horrocks, all of these same men who are involved in these reform activities. And the transcript and the transcript of the signatures, Susan has provided that as well. So I want you to take a look at that. And just to emphasize the idea of usefulness, this map has always intrigued me. You can see already by 1843, Bible Christian Jeremiah Horrocks has established his bleaching enterprise here. On the other side, Samuel Pilling and his calico printing enterprise there. But of all the churches in Frankfurt at the time, only two stand out. One, the Free Baptist Church, although it was no longer, by then it was the New Jerusalem Church, and the Hicksite, by then the Quakers had split. This is the Hicksite Meeting House, which tells me that someone, whoever created this map, that thought perhaps those congregations had an outsized contribution to the community. But charity was a goal. It wasn't necessarily always a reality. And by 1854, the church was already a few decades old. This is just after consolidation. So you have growing pains within the church, and you have growing pains within the city where people's loyalties are being drawn, whether they should be loyal to the city of Philadelphia, where they've always been loyal to this independent borough of Frankfurt. And so this lawsuit comes out of a disputed election, of all things. James Seddon and Nathan Burnham are vying for votes to be pastor of the congregation. James Seddon receives the most amount of votes, well, except Thomas Seibotham, Enoch Swope, and Henry Guernsey, the trustees, think that there are some fraudulent votes, people who have voted that weren't really members. So there's a dispute, which turns into the trustees end up calling in the Frankfurt police. James Seddon is carried away, so there's an assault and battery charge involved as well. The case file down the city archives is about yay big. And the ironic part of this is that because the city was recently consolidated, this is one of the first articles about Frankfurt that actually show up in the Philadelphia newspaper. And it's this great sensational story about this charitable church that is excruciatingly uncharitable. And in the end, the court decides that, really they have no jurisdiction at all over this vote for the pastor, but they could step in if the trustees tried again to lock people out of the church. So that led actually to the improbable scenario of two Swedenborgian churches in Frankfurt for about 15 years, within a half mile of one another. The New Jerusalem Society of Frankfurt, which is in the old location on Hedge and Bowser Streets. This particular church that's in this picture was constructed about 1851 on the site of the old Free Will Baptist Church. And then a new church, and if you haven't had a chance to see the painting of it, it's in the exhibit. I hope you'll take a minute to look at that. A new church at the corner of what was Main Street then, Frankfurt Avenue, and Fillmore Street. And a few items that also were great new finds in the collection were these two communion sets that the Worrell family had donated some time ago, but recently surfaced in the collection, and we had restored and polished. But it shows this schism as well, because the first set were donated to in gratitude to James Seddon. The others donated by Elizabeth Castor Rohrer to the Third Philadelphia Society. There was some, during the Civil War, there were, I think there was some remorse, because this schism literally split families. The Lever family was one that was split half and half. The Worrell family was split, some in the New Jerusalem Society of Frankfurt, others in the Third Philadelphia Society. When Reverend Seddon passed away at the end of the Civil War in 1865, Benjamin Barrett, who has been the pastor of the First Philadelphia Society at Broad and Brandywine Streets during the war, becomes the new mentor for the congregation. There is a poster on this in the exhibit, but I wanted to make sure you saw him, because Benjamin Barrett is one of my favorite characters. His hero, actually, is Reverend John Cluse, whom I mentioned earlier, because of his non-sectarian approach, his emphasis on charity. And one of Benjamin Barrett's finest hours, he did speak out against slavery in the pulpit during the Civil War. But even after the Civil War, the practice of forcing people of color to ride outside of the streetcar, in the front of the streetcar, in the wind and the rain and the possibility of collision, this was still persisting after the Civil War. Any of you who have taken a walking tour of Frankfurt or seen the memorial to Reverend Richard Robertson that's in front of Campbell AME Church may know that he died because of this exact issue. In November of 1862, on literally a cold and stormy night, the elderly Reverend Robinson, being black, was forced to ride on the exterior of the car, and there was a collision, and he was fatally injured by flying debris. The Christian recorder records his cortege going from Campbell AME Church down Hedge Street, past what was the New Jerusalem Society of Frankfurt, to Reverend Robinson's house on Bowser Street. So Benjamin Barrett speaks out about this practice in the pulpit. The AME Christian Recorder calls it his great sermon. They publish it in full, as does the press. And as was usual with Benjamin Barrett, his sermons, as they were published in the newspaper, often had one connotation, and then when they recorded the sermon the next day, it had a very different one. Well, the way it was advertised in the paper, our Philadelphia type of Christianity and who chiefly are responsible for it, fairly innocuous. But his point is that the Philadelphia type of Christianity is that most of the white preachers in the city were up in arms about the fact that the streetcars were running on Sunday, which was not a position that Barrett took, because he felt working class people needed to be able to ride in the streetcars on Sunday. But they would not speak out against this discrimination against Black people on riding in the streetcars. And So he's hailed for this. And in fact, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, Mary Grew, comments that there were really only 3 ministers in Philadelphia, white ministers. Of course, it was spoken out in the black pulpits, but only 3 white ministers that were speaking out against this: Reverend Barrett, William Furness of the First Unitarian Church, and Phillips Brooks of Trinity Church on Rittenhouse Square. John Lieber, those of you who have been in the exhibit have seen his drawing, which I've used as the cover of my book and the centerpiece. John Lieber, his family were Bible Christians, came in the 1820s, settled in the Kensington Church, but came to Frankfurt to the New Jerusalem Society in the 1840s, I think primarily because of the music program and other youth programs. He becomes a talented musician and artist. In fact, the first reference to this sketch is in one of the papers read at the Historical Society about William Trost Richards, the famous landscape artist, who was a classmate of John Lieber at Central High School, and also apparently was a sketching partner in the hills and the regions around Frankfurt. And this was then donated by John Lieber's family. I have no images of John Lieber, but these are 2 of his first cousins, also Bible Christians, who came a few years later and eventually became part of the New Jerusalem Church. William Lieber was my great-great-grandfather, and Ann Lieber Stern, the wife of Thaddeus Stern, an alderman here in Frankfurt, and also the grandmother of Justice Allen M. Stern, for whom the public school is named. By the time, at this point, the 2 churches had not yet joined forces, but they were starting to work together. They had come up with the Joint Sunday School Association, and I think they were starting to realize that it was sectarianism that really had broken them apart, and they separated completely from both sides of the Swedenborg discussion controversy at the time, and created their own denomination, which they called the New Church Congregational Union, which is really virtually invisible because they weren't reporting to either portion of the larger groups of the denominations of the church. Fortunately, the one reference to them, the New Church Monthly, they published it for 3 years. It was kind of a mixed bag magazine. T.S. Arthur, the magazine editor, who was also a member of the First Philadelphia Church, George Burnham of the Baldwin Locomotive Firm, both very involved in social and civic reforms, wrote for the magazine. And one of his focuses goes back to Barrett's interest in John Close and his non-sectarianism. And one of the things they're looking for, which kind of widens this circle, is that they go around, they look for news all around the country about what they call the descent of the New Age. In other words, looking for places where not just Christian denominations, but people of all religions are finding ways to get along. And that's part of what they focus their news on. Finally, in 1871, the 2 congregations have a reunion, and this is the site of the current church on Paul Street above Unity, but this is the church prior to that. Reverend John McPherson is the next most important minister of the church. Again, he kind of fulfills this tradition of the non-traditional. He was raised a Quaker in Ohio, gets his degree in medicine, goes to Indiana to practice, meets Reverend John Washburn, who is a Presbyterian minister and an attorney, but who is also, his wife is a Methodist lay minister who, she's a fascinating person in her own right. But Washburn has become very involved with Quakers nationally and locally in the peace movement. He and and McPherson come to Philadelphia, I believe about the time of the centennial for the peace conferences there, join yet another independent Christian association in Kensington, but are finally drawn to Swedenborg's writings, and both are ordained in the new church. But Washburn becomes particularly famous here in Philadelphia because he is involved with the Quakers and the Bible Christians in the Universal Peace Union, and effectively arbitrates a long-running strike between the shoemakers and the shoe manufacturers, which leads to the creation of a court of arbitration here in Philadelphia. And he moves on soon after that, but the Universal Peace Union maintains their interest in arbitration, and in fact begins focusing on international arbitration. Reverend Henry S. Clubb was very involved in the Universal Peace Union as well, as the Bible Christian minister, but he has an interesting connection to Frankfurt. He resurrects the Vegetarian Society of America in 1887. It had been founded initially in the 1850s by Reverend William Metcalf, who brought the first group of Bible Christians to Philadelphia. But he establishes a headquarters in Northwood on Fulcrod Street in 1897. He resides in this big house. They produce their magazine there. They have conferences there. They have vegetarian picnics on the lawn. And it's interesting, when they first move there, they obviously have great vegetarian hopes for Northwood. And as the editor of the magazine, Henry Clubb, says, it's gradually becoming a vegetarian settlement, as we now have 3 houses where no bodies of animals, birds, and fishes are eaten. John Stockwell, just when I thought the ministers couldn't get any more interesting, John Wesley Stockwell, fascinating character, comes here from Maine with his family. He's a newspaper editor for 3 years with the short-lived Philadelphia Evening Star, an associate paper of the Washington Evening Star. He gets his theological degree from the New Church School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His first pastorate is in Chicago, and that's where he gets very involved in the social gospel. This is the center of the universe for the social gospel. Jane Addams, he has his church, but he also enrolls in the University of Chicago, gets a degree in ecclesiastical sociology, essentially the social gospel. And he's very interested in theater. In the stockyards, he works with Jane Addams and the New Church, the University of Chicago settlement with theater groups for working class men and women. And he brings his love of theater back to Philadelphia. His thesis is on theater as the handmaiden of the church. And here he meets, of course, many of you might have seen, I hope, in the exhibit, or maybe heard me speak about her before, Edna Randolph Worrell, who is writing and composing. She's an editor of music in the Ladies' Home Journal. The two of them, really born the same year, powerhouses. You have one, interested in theater and the other in music, and they light up the church and the youth. When John Stockwell comes to Frankfurt, they use the old Hedge Street building as a social service center. They call it the Knowledge Extension Society. They outfit it with a baseball. There's a baseball team, a winning American football team, a soccer team, a track team, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, the Boys Club. This is my grandmother's eldest brother, Ed Lever, who was on the baseball team. The Diamonds have FBC for Frankfurt Boys Club, and he was also the president of the Boys Club. His sister Flossie was president of the Girls Club. They were both worked in the milliner's trade in Frankfurt. It's also the first church through their social service agency. The city of Philadelphia gives them permission to do an after-school program in the public schools here. He starts a social service church in the Empire Theater. Some of you may recognize this facade. I showed a picture of it the last time I did a presentation when it was the music hall. And this photo, actually, you could tell on the basis of the vaudeville show that was going on, was taken just probably about 6 months. It was a non-denominational service, very simple, Lord's Prayer, sermon, maybe a motion picture. Christian motion pictures were starting to become a thing. And it was a way of bringing the parents of some of the children that were involved in the social service program. The church would shut down, the movie theater shut down for renovations in 1914, but Reverend Stockwell began a lecture program that was very popular on topics from cathedrals to cubism, which was a very controversial topic at the time. But he managed to find a religious symbolism in it, which was really fascinating. They open up again with the new Windsor Theater on the other end of Frankfurt, 4220 Kensington Avenue, that continues to the edge of World War I. When John Stockwell and other members of the social service agencies in Philadelphia are starting to work together with the city to find ways to coordinate and manage all these social service projects. So by 1917, in the beginning of the war, the city has started to take over some of these programs that were run by churches. And this is Bill Patterson's photograph from the Philadelphia Sketch Club archives. This was probably the most successful time at the Frankfurt Church. They were coming off the success of the social service, and also, just like after the Civil War, after the First World War, and as will be true after the Second World War, Swedenborg's views of the peaceful transition from the physical life to the spiritual life were very reassuring to people who had lost loved ones during wartime. And so the church tended to grow during these post-war periods. William Gray, at the time he was selected to be an architect, was the principal of the William Penn High School for Girls, which is now the Franklin Learning Center in Spring Garden. He had been chair of the art department at Central High School, and he creates this classic Gothic chapel. And some of you may not realize, though, that William Gray had a previous contract or made a previous proposal for people in Frankfurt for a memorial building. This 1919 Community Buildings as War Memorials pamphlet was trying to encourage communities across the country that wanted to have a war memorial to build something useful, that building that would serve as community center, but also have a memorial with it. And so William Gray designs this for Frankfurt, but as all of you know who have seen the War Memorial here in Frankfurt that was built by Paul Cray in 1922, that was a decision to move away from William Gray's design. And before we leave Reverend Stockwell, one of his last very important contributions to the religious life in Philadelphia grew out of his interest in the sesquicentennial. The sesquicentennial ended up not being the sort of celebration that they had hoped at the time when they started planning it in 1923. But John Stockwell got on board the religious committee of the sesquicentennial right at the get-go. He had visions of being able to create a parliament of religions here in Philadelphia, as they had in the 1893 Chicago Exposition, which was the brainchild of a Swedenborgian, Charles Bonney, and had brought a lot of positive PR for the church. That never materialized, but he was asked to give an opening essay to interest people in the sesquicentennial, to broadcast from Chicago. If you haven't seen it, take a minute in the exhibit. I didn't have time to read it, but the first page of his essay, Imagining the Sesquicentennial in 1926, is so creative, and it shows this sort of childlike wonder that Stockwell had, that you could see made him so charismatic, both to his parishioners and to the young people. So this was a prize contest. Stockwell loved prize contests, but he was going to read this essay about to encourage people to get enthusiastic about the sesquicentennial. The contest was that shorthand writers across the country were to take a shorthand version of his essay and send it in, and whoever had the best transcription would win the prize. That actually was controversial here in Philadelphia. The court stenographers were up in arms because they were disqualified from entering this contest. But on the basis of this, he was always interested in new media. And he takes this interest in the radio and finds a way of witnessing with it, making it a religious outreach. And as the Inquirer said in October of 1923, when he started this broadcast, very simple religious broadcast, Bible passage, brief message, possibly a prayer. And it was the first time that Bible passages were read across the air. He was known at that time just as the Voice. Nobody knew who he was. By 1925, though, he was well known, very popular, and his program had become what he called the first undenominational radio church. And there had been dabblings in undenominational radio programs in the air before that. But Stockwell, as you can see, he says that he believed it was the first of its kind in America for the purpose of promoting good fellowship and love. So he probably felt perhaps safe in saying it was first. So Stockwell has gotten very involved now in the radio. He's editing a small publication, Swedenborgian publication called The Helper, and he resigns his position as minister of the Frankfurt Church. Dr. Leonard Taffel brings very different experiences to Frankfurt. He brings a family for the first time. So the congregation needs to support him and his family. But he particularly his experience in the First World War. He was trained as a homeopathic physician in Baltimore, went to Minnesota where he served in a homeopathic mental hospital for his internship. He served on an Native American reservation in South Dakota, where he practiced homeopathy, and at least according to family lore, also talked with the Native Americans who were interested in some of the aspects of Swedenborgian spirituality. And then he enlisted with the evacuation hospital that served in Europe during the war. Mrs. Taffel was a German war bride. And one interesting piece, of course, everyone, I've written about World War II in Frankfurt, but one interesting connection to the church was the old Hedge Street Church during World War II. It ceased to be a social service center. And in fact, Justice Alan Stern, through his Masonic connections, rented it for just $1 a year to the Northeast Demolay. And they suggested during the Second World War that they use the building as the headquarters for Air Warden Sector 6, and that the young men of the Demolay would also be volunteers in the program there. So that's how the building is used. And Sector 6 at that time was Frankfurt Avenue, founded by Frankfurt Avenue, Kinsey Street, Harrison Street, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, which I thought was really interesting because my mother would have been a student at Frankfurt High School at the time, and her home would have been just inside the sector at 1918 Harrison Street. But another item that I hope, along with that little book that Fred and I hope to find here, I would love to find this motion picture. Harry Donnett, who was the air warden, enlisted about 200 residents of the sector for a motion picture about a warden's busy life in Sector 6. And apparently they were demonstrating, rescuing people from a burning building, first aid. So hopefully that will turn up at some point. When at the end of the war, one of the things to emphasize here too, and I hope I've kind of made this point, that the New Jerusalem Church was very much the center of activity here. It was very much part of the religious community. People did not ask, even in the 1940s, who are the Swedenborgians? Where's the New Jerusalem Church? They were very involved. Reverend Taffel, right after the surrender of Germany and just before the surrender of Japan, as a member of the Frankfurt Ministerium, is the lead minister for these union services that are held during the summertime with all the ministers in Frankfurt participating. But he also becomes more in demand for his insight into returning veterans, having been one. And he's elected president of the national denomination, which brings Frankfurt to the forefront on one sense, but also leaves them without a minister. And the lay leaders need to step up. For a period of time, in 1949, they were able to field a successful softball team with the Northeast Church League. They were able to follow through. Before the war, the young men and women of the Sunday School Association wanted to build an addition to the church. They believed that they were going to raise their families there. The new generation was going to use this Sunday school building, and a whole new generation of Swedenborgians in Frankfurt would be able to use this church. They finally raised the money, break ground. This is Edna Worrell, still active at that period of time, still very involved in the music program. They break ground in 1950 for this edition. In 1951, the national denomination has its annual meeting in Philadelphia. So people from all around the country come to Frankfurt to dedicate this new Sunday school building. There's a worship service, a spaghetti dinner, music. Frankfurt is the center of the Swedenborgian universe for a brief period of time. But by 1958, when the denomination comes back to Philadelphia for its national conference, no one comes to Frankfurt. There are 34 people on the roll. Sadly, all those young families who were going to raise their children in the Sunday school annex that they had built in 1950 and 1951 were now in churches in New Jersey and in the suburbs. And the national church met in venues in downtown Philadelphia, in Wilmington, and in the suburbs. When Edna Worrell passed away in 1961, that was the end of the membership list. Reverend Taffel passes away in 1971. The church is purchased by the American Legion Police Post 937, and they use it briefly as a chapel. Fred can tell you a little bit about that period of time. It didn't last long. And by 1982, when the University of Pennsylvania's made a neighborhood study of East Frankfurt, here's the church, doesn't even merit a caption. It's just really sort of the poster child for a declining neighborhood. But fortunately and sadly, I think because the church is currently mourning, Reverend, I'll go ahead and show you his picture. In September of 1982, another community of faith saw some potential in this building. And Reverend Mary Moses, Hazel Moses, who recently passed away as the bishop of this denomination at the age of 94. And Reverend Aaron Kidd, whose picture is here on this slide, was hoping to be here today. But Reverend, the bishop passed away just a few days ago. And if you go by the church, there is still mourning cloth on the front door. But Reverend Kidd graciously invited my husband and I into the church, and you can see elements of William Gray's Gothic design in the woodwork, in the beautiful rose windows. There's a blue one behind the pulpit. There's a red, this one in the front of the church is red, much of the stained glass. And as anyone who worships in an historic church or has had to care for an historic church knows, it's not easy. And I think they've done a fine job. And what I think is interesting, and one of the things I had hoped he might be able to share, is Reverend Kidd is actively working to produce a music ministry. Music is sort of the center of what they're doing there. And I thought that was a great circle back to the early 19th century when the music was the centerpiece of the New Jerusalem Church. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yes.
How supportive was the early church leaders of the Campbell AME church?
Well, what's interesting, of course, it wasn't Campbell then. It was Second Bethel. And the early minutes, the minutes have a gap. The records of the New Jerusalem Church are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And there are minutes that go from the mid-1840s and stop in the early 1850s and then pick up again in the 1870s. And some things that do show up in the minutes, for instance, not only the AMA members, but other early Black congregations did use the church, rent the church, the New Jerusalem, the church frequently. And also, and I'm trying to remember what year it was, I think it was soon after the new church on Hedge and Bowser was built in 1851. There is mention in the minutes that there was a discussion between the AME church, which at that point would have been was Oxford, but is now Kinsey. The discussions between the AME church and the New Jerusalem Church on Head Street about swapping churches. I think the AME church may have wanted to be closer to, because I think their minister lived on Bowser Street. Many of their members lived on Bowser Street. That was kind of the center of the African American community. And in the end, they didn't do that. But they did work. I mean, as I said, I believe in some ways their style of worship was perhaps more similar to one another than, because the white Methodists had still not gained a foothold in Frankfurt, even by the late 1830s. So Thomas Boyle's sort of Methodist brand of that Free Will Baptist and Swedenborgianism was a different style of worship, which would have been more akin, of course, to the African Methodists as well. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
I'm curious how much vegetarianism was kept. Like, were any?
Well, that's interesting, because I wish like I said, if I had known. I mean, my grandmother's, great grandmother was a Bible Christian. The only kind of anecdote I have on that is Thomas Sidebotham, whose picture I showed you, was my great grandfather, and he started a tape weaving industry here that became known as John Sidebotham Inc., named for his son. His great-grandson, Jack Sidebotham III, who just recently passed away, when I started talking to him about this research, and he said that he could remember his grandmother was the granddaughter, I believe, of Jeremiah Horrocks. And he said that she still practiced during his lifetime. So, I mean, she still practiced vegetarianism. And what I thought was interesting, and I wrote a little piece about the Bible Christians for the New Church Messenger some while back, kind of wondering about that same thing myself. And I didn't know, but what I thought was interesting was that in the minutes when they talked about things that they purchased for, outings for picnics, that even in the summertime, they were taking cranberries and nuts. And so I think for those people, certainly the leavers, at least for the first generation or so, I think they probably did adhere to it. And then, of course, it did take, in fact, Reverend Metcalf, during the cholera epidemic of 1849, went on record as saying that the vegetarian diet, that no one in his congregation had come down with cholera, and they really attributed that to the vegetarian lifestyle. Anybody else? Yes. I beg your pardon?
Burial ground, graveyard, cemetery.
Yes, in fact, and that became, I didn't go into that, that was yet another legal battle. When the Hedge Street Church became the James Seddon Public School in the 1890s, it was a special school. It was rented by the city of Philadelphia as a public school. Well, a descendant of one of the early members of the Free Will Baptists came forward and brought a lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia and the church because the playground for the school was in the location of the old graveyard. Now, there was reference in the minutes well prior to that when Cedar Hill Cemetery was constructed, many of the families who had buried people in the churchyard there transferred them to Cedar Hill. Many people had already removed family members from the grave site. And in the end, it was really bad PR, I can put it that way. But in the end, the city won the lawsuit. The church had been able to demonstrate that it had done due diligence in trying to contact people who had family members buried there. And in the end, in fact, the gentleman that had brought the lawsuit passed away before a judgment was, so it ended up. But yes, there was, and that was an issue, though, again, when the church when the old church was going to be sold. They sold the church in 1950 in order to get funds to build this addition on the church on Paul Street. And so when they sold the church, they also had to go through that process again of listing the names of all the people who they believed had been buried there, posting it in the newspaper. So I remember I talked to Reverend Taffel's sons when they were still living about 10 years ago. And that was one of the things that they remembered having to do at the time that they were selling that building, was to demonstrate that they had done their best to make sure that there were no bodies that remained in the cemetery. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you'll take some time to have some refreshments, visit the exhibit. My husband, Mike, who I didn't acknowledge as being my right-hand person through, all of this process. And so if anybody's interested in the books, or if you have any questions, I'll be floating around. But thank you again for your interest and for coming today. So, all right. Bye.
And if you're wondering what I was doing, there's a lot of formatting.
Volume 2. He's heard this lecture before. I'll leave it on.